One of the research topics I've been working on for a while has to do with pay for performance. The advice that most consultants and experts give to organizations, companies, and for that matter, nonprofit organizations and charitable organizations, is that pay shouldn't just be in the form of a salary with benefits, or for hourly wage people, a wage and benefits, because that's payment for time, payment for input, I call it. You show up, you get paid, kind of irrespective of your own performance or your department's performance or your business unit's performance, or certainly the entire organization's performance. So most of the specialists in this field for a decade or two have been recommending that pay be increasingly tied to one or another type and measure of performance. So part of the pay package would in effect be at risk. If the performance was there, that portion of pay would come in, perhaps in the form of a bonus or a profit share or another kind of variable piece of pay. But if the performance wasn't there, those payments wouldn't be made. And so you'd just have what portion of the pay is in wage or salary plus benefits. And interestingly enough, there's been a large actual real-world movement in the direction of having pay, at least in part, based upon performance. A couple of figures make the point. In 1970 or so, if you exclude salespeople who've always been paid in part or in whole on commission, about 5% of everybody else on a payroll in the United States, including managers and executives, were paid wages, salaries, and benefits, payment for time, payment for input. 95% were paid that way. Only 5% were paid in some form of variable pay. By 2000, about 65 to 70% of everybody on a payroll had at least some of their pay tied up in performance-based pay, their own performance, their department, their business units, their entire organizations. So you can say a lot more people now have some pay at risk than used to, and that is true and is a very important fact. One of the many reasons it's important is that it has a certain macroeconomic effect, by which I mean it was popular in most recessions for companies to respond by cutting jobs, and so people were thrown out of work. But you can get to the same objective, namely reducing the ratio of labor cost or payroll cost to total cost, by cutting pay rates rather than jobs, or cutting pay rates for some jobs and cutting other jobs per se. Now, it's not popular at all to cut pay rates, and people worry about the demotivation effect. But if you have a pay system in which people are eligible for a bonus or a profit-sharing plan or a stock distribution, if the organization performs well, the other side of that is if the organization doesn't perform well, those bonus payments and profit-sharing payments and stock awards are not made. That's what happened in 2000, 2001, 2002, and part of 2003 in that recession. The 90s, especially the second half, were the go-go years, and every pay plan of every type paid off handsomely. But in the recession of the early 2000s, a lot of those payments were not made. You were eligible for a bonus, but the performance of your unit wasn't there, you didn't get it. You were eligible for a profit-sharing plan. The company was not profitable, may have had an operating loss, you got no profit-sharing payment. That is, in effect, a total compensation reduction. And one of the most interesting things about that time period was that unemployment, which usually rises rapidly in a recession, rose a couple points. We got close to 6%. But if the pay system had been the same that it was in 1970, mostly everybody paid for showing up, we would have had unemployment 2 or 3 points higher. So what we've gotten to is this flex. If you think of a kind of an accordion, you flex it in and you flex it out. That's what's happened to compensation for most people on payrolls, if you take the last couple of decades in particular. Now, the one large conundrum, problem in this area, perhaps surprisingly, has to do with executives, top-level executives. And one would figure that if pay for performance is the way organizations operate in terms of their compensation system, this would certainly be true, most true, for people at the top. After all, they're responsible, presumably, for guiding their corporation, setting the strategy, executing it, achieving objectives, and so on. And what's interesting, and for many people troublesome, is that studies of the determinants of top executive compensation, you take a sample of companies, you take the total comp of the CEOs and CFOs and heads of marketing and other top executives of those companies, and they vary quite a bit, and you ask the question, well, what explains the variance? You would expect that the different performance of the companies would correlate very strongly with the different compensation levels of those top executives. And study after study shows that that, in fact, is not the case. That the performance of the company, say, lagged a year or two, is not at all a good predictor of, or even a strong correlate of, subsequent top executive compensation, suggesting that the pay is not for performance at those senior-most levels. Maybe it also means pay for performance operates for everybody else. Well, the same sets of studies find that certain other factors are strongly associated with differences in top executive pay. The most important of those factors, in terms of the strength of its association, is company size. The larger the company, the higher the pay for top executives. And you can measure company size by sales revenue, you could measure it by assets, you could measure it by employment, you could measure it by all three. People have tried all versions. This finding has held up for over 4 decades of research, different time periods, different databases, different methodologies, more superior ones now. Same finding. Company size is the strongest correlate of differences in top executive compensation. And when I say correlate, this is not simply a how does size go together with compensation. It's how does size, verticality of a corporation, company performance, what industry it's in, how much capital it expends per employee. This is multivariate or regression analysis, so we're talking about a regression coefficient on size, always significant, always large. And the second significant factor, and these are the two that show up in all the studies, is the number of levels of management. The more of them there are, the higher the executive compensation. So hierarchy pays off in this limited sense of top executive compensation. What makes this finding ironic or even more troublesome is that we are supposed to have, in the last decade and a half or two, been in an era of delayering, of getting flatter organizations to push decision-making down and have team-based, self-managed people at work. And some of that certainly has happened, but it still looks like verticality pays off. So when it comes to the top levels of organizations, where you would expect the strongest relationship between pay and performance, in fact, it looks like that's where the weakest relationships are. And meanwhile, everybody else on a payroll seems to be having more of their pay at risk tied up with company performance. This is why some people feel strongly that there has to be a complete transformation in executive compensation. Although it should be pointed out that no legislation has really limited such compensation. Even the Sarbanes-Oxley legislation, which has done a lot of other things about governance, has not addressed that issue. Generally speaking, political bodies shy away from that. They'll regulate compensation somewhat at the lower end, minimum wages, living wages, but they won't do it at the upper ends. And perhaps the final point and the fine point to put on this is that studies of the ratio of top executive compensation to either average employee compensation or lowest worker compensation continue to show widening ratios. The two most recent studies done earlier in this decade estimated the average the CEO to average employee compensation ratio in samples of several hundred companies at 458 to 1, and the other study at 500 to 1. Back in 1970, these ratios were generally in the 50 to 75 range. So we've had a tremendous increase in the compensation of CEOs relative to the average employee, and that compensation for these top-level executives, CEOs and others, looks like it's not related to performance. And this is perhaps the most challenging issue in this entire area, both in terms of analyzing it and in terms of deciding what, if anything, should be done about it. So it makes for good research fodder.